In biology, a community is all of the different organisms, or made up of all of the organisms or living things present in an area. And so community ecology is how we study the makeup of living things in an area. And so we can look at this from a couple of different ways, like the species richness, the species diversity that we'll talk about. We also look at community succession, so how organisms arrive in an area and change over time. And a special case study of that is how that happens on islands. So we'll start out by talking about species richness and species diversity. So species richness is a measure of the number of species in a community. And so this is a geographic area that's been defined as a community. Species richness shows equatorial trends, like we so often see globally. So we have the highest amount of species richness at the equator. So here's our globe. We have the highest here at the equator, and then it decreases as you move towards either pole. We also see a couple of variations in the equatorial trend. So again, in general, this is the equatorial trend, but mountainous regions will show a higher richness than you would predict based on their relation to the equator, and you see lower in peninsulas than you would predict based on distance from the equator. So for example, Florida here is a peninsula, and so you see a reduction in species richness because presumably organisms had to move down there, and so that slows down how much species make their way to the peninsula. So why this species richness gradient exists, the equatorial gradient. So remember, we're talking here about the equatorial trend. Why this appears to be the case is a matter of speculation, and there's three major hypotheses that compete, and really they maybe are not exclusive, but may be true for different areas and under certain conditions or circumstances. So the first hypothesis is called the time hypothesis, and it postulates that communities diversify or gain species over time. So just the longer that an area has been exposed. So when we say time, we mean exposed, not underwater or ice, right? Because this gets a little confusing because the Earth is always all of the Earth is 4.4 billion years old, right? So when we say there's a time difference, we're not talking about the actual age, but how long it's not been exposed, or how long it's been exposed. Again, not under either water or ice. And so, for example, temperate regions have less species richness or lower species richness than tropical ones because they were under ice more recently. So in the last ice age, more of the temperate regions were covered in ice, the equator was not. So there's been more time for equatorial regions to gain diversity. And so a specific example is in studies of worm species looking at lakes. And so they find that in unglaciated lakes, that is lakes that have not been covered in ice for a long time, there's more worm diversity than in lakes that still have glaciers on them. Now, the drawback to the time hypothesis is that it really doesn't make sense with marine environments. The ocean is always underwater, I should say, and you don't see a significant difference in ice. You might have ice floating on the top, but that's not impacting the richness in the water. And so this suggests that some other explanation must exist for marine environments because we still see an equatorial trend for oceans. The area hypothesis postulates that larger areas of similar biome have more species because they're bigger and have more resources to support larger populations and a greater range of habitats. So this just says, okay, when you look at the equator, you have this really huge, vast tract of biome that's all really similar, all wrapping along the equator. And if you go towards the poles, those biomes get smaller. And so that must explain the difference. And so one study has shown that if you have a tree host, you have a higher species richness for insects that live in the tree. So this is a graph of that. This is the range of a host tree, and on the y-axis is the amount of insect diversity or richness in those trees. And there's a general pattern, an approximately linear relationship. The bigger the host tree range, the greater the diversity of insects. But again, there's exceptions to this. The tundra is a very large biome, but it has relatively low species richness. The third hypothesis is the productivity hypothesis, and it says that, okay, none of all that stuff matters. It's really just about productivity, and productivity is a measure of plant production. So this is about a measure of plant growth. And it says wherever you have the highest plant growth is where you're going to have the greatest species richness, because more plant growth means more food for everybody else. And plant production depends on things like temperature and water. And so warm, moist climates near the equator are going to have greater productivity, therefore greater species richness. And so the tropical rainforest would be a classic example of this. And so this sounds very reasonable. There's some exceptions as well here. So for example, when you look at tropical seas, some of them actually have relatively low photosynthetic productivity, so they don't have that much plant matter, but they still have high species richness. And then on the other hand, if you look in the Antarctic Ocean, you have high productivity but low species richness. So again, we don't see that this one always applies. But like I said at the beginning, it may be that these are just ways to understand this equatorial trend, and it may be all and sometimes all of these are sometimes true in some areas, or they might have sort of additive effects in certain areas. So it's just a way to understand this effect, but it's definitely there. We have higher species richness at the equator. So another term that gets used to describe communities is species diversity instead of species richness. And so the species diversity value takes into account not just how many species there are, but how many of those species, how many of each species there are. So to give you an example, let's look at two different areas. We have area A and area B. And in area A, we might have two species, and in area B, we might have two species. So they have the exact same species richness. So again, that would give them identical species richness for having two species. However, in area A, there is 90% of one species and 10% of another species. And in area B, there is 50-50 of each species. So this is taking into account the relative abundance. So because area A is mostly one species and only a small number of the other species, this would have less diversity. And this one, which is 50-50, would have more diversity. So again, their richness is identical, but their diversity would be different when you take into account the abundance. Now, there's a lot of complicated ways to calculate this value. We won't get into those calculations. However, I'll just mention that there's something called the Shannon Diversity Index that measures the diversity in a community, and the higher value means that there's greater diversity in that community. So why do we care about species richness and species diversity? We have a reason to believe that diversity and richness in a community stabilizes it. Stability means that there's little to no change over time in a community. So if you were to look at it over time, you would see maybe little minor ups and downs, but you don't see this happening in a stable community. You don't see organisms dying and coming back and dying and coming back. You see a more gradual change. And so the diversity stability hypothesis is that disturbances in a species-rich community are cushioned by large numbers of interacting species, and therefore would not produce as drastic an effect as it would on a less diverse community. So in other words, species diversity helps to stabilize communities. And again, this is in the face of disturbances. So what's a disturbance? This can be things like floods, droughts, human disturbances. All of these can be, the impact of these disturbances can be minimized by species diversity. So one famous study related to this looked at many different plots of grassland over time and monitored the species richness of the area. So that's on the x-axis. And then a measure of the biomass change from year to year. So this is like taking all of the grass and measuring how much there is every year. And so a stable community would have less change. So a lower value is a more stable community. And what they found in this study was, in fact, the higher the diversity value, so this is higher this way, the lower the change. So therefore, the more stable the ecosystem was. And so their sort of explanation for this is, like, say there's a drought. In a year of drought, species A really needs water, and so it doesn't do well. But species B is more water neutral, and so it does fine. It helps to stabilize the community. But maybe in a wet year, species A does really well, and species B does not do as well, right? So depending on the environmental conditions, one species is doing better than the other, but as long as you have both species, the community remains stable. If you lost one of those species, then you would have high variability. If species B went extinct, then in a drought year, you would have very low biomass in that community, and that would be bad for that community. It would only do well in wet years, and that would cause the community to have these dramatic fluctuations and be less stable when they face disturbances. So this is why conservation, this is one argument for conservation of species. The idea that just having species around, whether they're really cool or we really like them, or maybe it's just like this humble worm or insect, its presence in that community is inherently stabilizing because diversity and richness is stabilizing. And so as our ecosystems face more and more disruption due to climate change and human resource consumption, it's going to be really important to have as much diversity as possible.